So I put out a post recently talking about a post-employment engagement or post-employment scan technique. So firstly, everyone that replied to that, thanks for some comments and the replies that you put in there. So I'll sort of talk about a couple of those points today. I'll talk about a few of the considerations for it and just a general discussion. So the idea is not to be negative about the drill itself or kind of discredit it. It is what it is, and if people are using it to good effect, then perfect. It's more to kind of generate some thought, so some more critical thinking around the way that we do our preparation for kind of not just use of force, but anything where we've got people in the sort of emergency services or frontline services or emergency response type of thing. So our first responders. Because ultimately in these environments we're preparing for worst case and we're dealing with kind of life and death in some circumstances. So we just want to make sure that we're properly preparing or adequately preparing people for what they're going to confront and their ability to perform. So as far as the drill itself goes, so firstly, if it's a drill, then it's questionable straight away, because you should be teaching principles, and then there's certain kind of guidelines or parameters of that principle and how you apply it in different situations. So if you're teaching a drill, then straight away it's kind of questionable as to its utility. So when it comes to the scan, so the kind of origins of the scan that I'm referring to sort of comes from the sort of implementation of combat shooting. So I was lucky enough to be around when combat shooting was first kind of integrated into a specialist unit. And the idea was to create combat behaviours, a kind of combat mindset, and improve performance and sort of marksmanship shooting skills so that we would get better operational transfer, because the drills that we were doing previously just weren't fit for purpose anymore. They were kind of archaic, really. So the drills were implemented, and part of that was a scan, so a post-engagement scan, or a head check it's been referred to as, and that was kind of looking left, looking right on the range. So the idea of that was just to break concentration, focus, or that sort of visual fixation on the threat that was in front of you. So once you've dealt with that threat, it was more about then breaking from that fixation to look around to see what other information was important. So you could have a team member that needed help or assistance. There could be more threats. There could be something going on, because remember, these are quite dynamic, complex situations where things happen really quickly. And when you're involved in a shooting or sort of use of force or an incident of that magnitude, it's quite intense and there's a lot of emotion. So you do need something, or you potentially need something, to break that fixation from the threat, because we become very threat biased or threat focused. So that was the kind of intent of it. And then from that was kind of the base behavior or base habit to sort of do what is called habit stacking, where you can then build a better habit on top of that. So once you've got the initial kind of habit, you can actually build the behavior that you want, if done correctly. So as it's kind of evolved over the years, it's sort of grown into its own thing, more or less, or it appears to have grown into its own thing. So instead of just scanning left and right, there's a whole heap of sort of scans and movements involved in it, which may or may not be relevant depending on what your sort of threat environment is or what you're trying to do. But what I kind of observationally see is that this is a drill that has been passed down between units or passed down through different domains, where they're replicating the same thing or same drill, even though those domains have completely different threat environments. They have completely different sort of operational demands and needs and sort of mission roles. So it becomes questionable if they all need the same drill, or if they're just replicating something that they've seen before without really questioning, how do I adapt this to my situation or my environment? So the idea here is to generate a little bit more thought. So when it comes to that sort of evolution of the post-engagement scan, okay, there's a few things that we sort of want to start to consider. So it's kind of grown into its own thing, and it sort of appears as though it's been added onto and not evolved into the evolving threat or the emerging threat that we see. So the first question, like I said, is around that replication. Are people just replicating something that they've done before? And when it comes to evolving it, are they adding onto it for the sake of adding onto it based on opinion, or are they adding onto it because that's the feedback that's coming from the operational environment that it needs to evolve in that manner? So it's about adding onto something or evolving something based on an operational need or an operational understanding of how that can improve, not kind of using opinion, because to be honest, opinion was what got us where we were in the first place, where we had to redo the whole shooting package. And then one of the other things that needs to be considered when it comes to coaching is we sort of rely on this user-based model where if I'm a performance or if I'm an experienced operator, it's just assumed that I'm an expert, okay? And the reality is that expertise and experience are often completely different, or they're not very well associated to each other. Okay, just because you've got time in a role doesn't mean you're an expert at it. But what we see when it comes to instruction is in the military, quite often it's just a chronological thing that once you've got enough experience, you go on and become an instructor. Okay, law enforcement, okay, a lot of people choose to become instructors, okay, for various different reasons, but most of it's based on a user model, so that if you're a user or you've done it, then you should be able to teach it, where the reality is there's actually no real association between having experience and being a good instructor. Instruction is its own skill. And then when it comes to looking at teaching skills, okay, there's a whole heap of considerations around motor skill acquisition, around cognitive development of those skills, or the cognitive factors around human behavior. So if you've been an experienced performer, chances are you don't have a really deep understanding of the principles or knowledge in those associated areas. So for example, okay, when I was in the military, I was allowed to teach military specific things that I'd done. Okay, I've been involved in law enforcement a bit, and in law enforcement, I'm sort of encouraged not to talk about law enforcement specific things, so policies, procedures, that sort of thing, which is fine. I don't have a lot of experience on that. I'm happy with that. But then you see law enforcement officers teaching human behavior, skill acquisition, these sort of things, where they don't really have a background in that. So, you know, as a sort of behavioral scientist or a scientist who's done a fair bit of work in motor skill acquisition in behavior, these sort of things, okay, seeing them try and deliver something they don't know about, and this includes in the military, is that they don't have a really deep understanding. So the question has to be raised, should we start to incorporate specific scientists into our recruit programs or our development programs, so that now we've got a good understanding of both the operational needs or the sort of domain specific stuff from an operational requirement, plus the scientific understanding of how we teach these skills and how people behave, rather than kind of using bias or what our experience was. Because if we continue with the user model, okay, we just get previous experience, and if we've got a really rapidly evolving environment, that experience can become out of date, so it can no longer be relevant. So we can end up just preparing to refight the last war, which is not what we want. So going back to the drill itself, so the idea is look left, look right, okay, and that's supposed to open up your awareness or open up your peripheral sort of your visual arcs, so that you can increase your situation awareness, so you can understand what's going on. So the reality is, however, is that's not really how our gaze behavior works. So when we're under increased level of threat, our eyes fixate to salience or threat very quickly. It doesn't really matter where our head is turned. If it's in our field of view, your focal attention will be drawn to it straight away. So if it's threat-based, your gaze or your focal attention will be drawn to that very quickly, and you have really long fixations on that stimulus or that cue or what it is you're looking at. Okay, that could be good or bad. If that's the most important thing in the environment at the moment, then it's good. If there's other things that are more important, then it's not so good. So when it comes to situation awareness, okay, the first component of it is to look. Okay, you're not going to see something if you don't look at it. And even though we're looking, we're not exactly seeing, or we may not be specifically seeing what we need to see. So anyone that's kind of got a better understanding of this will have seen the research on inattentional blindness, which is where we may be looking at something but we don't see it. Okay? And if you're teaching situation awareness or decision making skills and you don't understand it, then I'd certainly encourage you to go and look at it and do a lot more professional development, so that you can teach what you need to teach, or you can get better outcomes or the right outcomes. So even though we're looking, we may not necessarily see it. If we do see it, then there's a recognition and identification component, so that we can understand what it means, which is where perception comes in. So a lot of the research I've sort of looked at or conducted has shown that there's a lot of error in that recognition and identification phase, and even some of the research from situation awareness shows that around 80% of your error comes from that perceptual component. Okay, and there's a couple of different factors in there, but from some of the stuff I've seen, the sort of positive identification component of that recognition and identification of those cues or that stimulus shows that fratricide or blue on blue or sort of mistake effect shooting is around about 30 to 95%. And some of the sort of stuff I've looked at within sort of early performers shows that it's up around 80 to 95%. So 80 to 95% of the time, they shoot a friendly, okay, in a very sort of quick exposure to a PID incident. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that sort of visual identification component. Okay, so when we look at the range, turning your head left and right really involves none of that. So it really has nothing to do with situation awareness. It's just teaching you to move your head. And then when you look at people that have learnt that behaviour on a range, quite often you'll see them in a reality-based or scenario-based training where they just turn their head, they don't actually see anything within the environment that they're looking at, and they may even be in an area where one side's a wall, but they'll still turn their head and look at it because they know that's the behaviour that they're supposed to demonstrate, rather than having an actual scan, looking, seeing, recognising. They just turn their head, okay? And there was a few people that sort of reported on that in the post comments. So when we look at the drill itself, it has really questionable transfer the way it's being done, or in a lot of circumstances. So when it comes to doing it on the range, if we're preparing for a later performance, then maybe it does have benefit, but if they're just learning that behavior, and that behavior is what they're being assessed on later on to deem sort of adequate or competent performance, then it's really not doing anything, okay? We're wasting the time that we have available to us on the range. So a lot of organizations do have limited range time, and if you're there doing an engagement of one shot and then a 5 to an 8 second scan, you're burning a lot of time and you're not necessarily being that efficient. So my thoughts would be that for the limited range time you have, you want to make sure that you're optimizing your time there. So the range can deliver some very specific things around the hard skills or the motor skill acquisition of sort of fast, rapid, effective shooting. So you probably want to focus more on the things that are going to allow you to perform really well in the hard skills that you need, and then do more work around that, or integrate into your program the cognitive skills, the behavioral skills, the emotional regulation skills that you need to be able to put it all together. And you sort of want to look at doing that quite early in your program, so that you're kind of interleaving those things in together, so that you're building a complete package or a complete performer. Okay, doing it all in blocks and then hoping that it transfers is not the most effective way to do it, especially if you're not utilizing your range time that efficiently to focus on the hard skills. And then when we look at some of our shooting, is that a lot of it's probably more around a compliance-based model anyway. And if people are replicating drills like a scan, then chances are they're replicating shooting drills based on what that drill is, not understanding the principle of what that skill is trying to develop when it comes to a motor skill pattern or motor skill development. So most drills have been developed quite effectively or for a purpose to improve a specific skill component or development of that skill component. So it becomes questionable, or it raises questions. If people are just replicating a simple behavioral drill, then are they just replicating shooting drills without understanding what they're trying to achieve by doing that drill? So I think it's worthwhile having a look at what we're doing, asking the right questions about, do we understand the principles of what we're trying to teach and what we're trying to actually achieve, so that we can then continue to coach sort of from that novice through to sort of a very early entry level, or try and accelerate the development of that sort of expertise and experience. So they're just some of the considerations that I want to bring out. There's a whole heap more that we could probably go into. There's probably a number of things I've missed, and certainly happy to discuss this with anybody or engage with it, or somebody wants to reach out, please do. It's more so just to get a little bit of, or explore some of the training that we're doing to create some better questions, so that we can start to look at it and determine, are we really using the limited time we have in training for the best effect? So the idea of training is that we want to accelerate expertise, so that that training should transfer quite well to the operational demand. So we see people perform as best as they can in that sort of early phase performance, and then within the operational environment they'll develop that sort of domain specific expertise anyway, or hopefully they will. So we just want to make sure that we're doing the best we can when it comes to preparing them for that performance. So the only way we can do that is to continually ask questions. Are we teaching the right thing? Do we understand the principles that we're trying to develop here? Okay, and then are we seeing what we want to see on the other side? Because ultimately it's about the performer and about their ability to perform in these sort of critical situations. Because if we're just focused on training for the purposes of training and replicating things that we've previously done, then we're probably letting them down, and they're carrying the risk and liability forward. So just something to think about, a little bit of an exploration. Like I said, happy to answer any questions. I hope it provoked a little bit of thought, a few questions. Hopefully if there's people that need to upgrade their performance or their training, they can. If you're doing a great job, perfect, continue to doing it. If you're doing some really good stuff, please let me know, because I'm always happy to see what people are doing better than what I'm doing, or things that I can learn. So appreciate your time. Thanks for the listen, and look forward to sort of exploring another topic in the future.